Once we have defined the research model, we should ask ourselves another question. How can we design a good questionnaire to gather the information we need? The challenge, usually, is to put together a questionnaire managing the trade-off between length and completeness. It will be very difficult to collect answers to a survey that is too long and time-consuming. But at the same time, we want to collect all the information we need. So we have to find a reasonable compromise. The first recommendation is to start from the research model. In our questionnaire, we need to include only questions that allow us to measure the constructs included in the model, and to make sure we cover all of them. We need to avoid the temptation to ask more questions just in case, because this would result in an unnecessarily long questionnaire. The only additional questions that are useful are those related to the profile of the respondent, person and/or organization, such as the role of the respondent or the size of the company, but only in case we are not able to retrieve this information in other ways, for example from external databases. Let's look again at our example, the IPS project. If you remember the research framework, it consisted in several building blocks, such as business strategy, purchasing organization, and so on. For each building block, we developed the related section of the questionnaire. The first section was named Firm Descriptives and Business Environment, which covered the elements labeled as control variables in the research model. Control variables are variables related to the context of the responses that can be used to better interpret results. For example, by collecting information about the company size, we can then discriminate between responses from small and large firms. At the beginning of the survey, we also collected a few basic information about the person actually answering the questionnaire, such as the role in the company. The next step is to formulate the single questions, making sure that we are going to really measure what we want. This issue is called validity, which refers to the correct measure of the concept under investigation. A very good and effective way to ensure validity is to rely as much as possible on existing questions already used in previous studies, so that they have already been tested and validated. In this way, we can also save time and effort, since we do not need to reinvent the wheel. In case we need to ask something that is so new that we cannot find previous studies about it, it is usually recommended to gather advice from subject experts, for example by asking their opinion on a first draft, thus increasing the chance to formulate an appropriate question. We can distinguish between objective and perceptive questions. Objective questions usually refer to facts and figures, and therefore ask respondents to report about something they should be informed about, but without any personal bias. Perceptive or judgmental questions, instead, are about opinions, or more in general qualitative concepts that imply a personal view. Both types of questions may be needed to investigate our research model, but of course, as long as we can rely on objective questions, we should do it. Questions should be neutral. They should not hint that there is a good or bad answer. We call social desirability bias the phenomenon that leads people to answer what they think would be more acceptable from others, and we need to do our best to avoid it. For example, if we ask, do you exploit child labor? Everybody will answer, no, of course. Instead, if you ask, to what extent do you adopt the following practices to prevent child labor within your supply chain, and you provide a list of methods and actions that can be adopted, you focus the attention of the respondent on objective concepts and you avoid influencing the answer. Besides formulating the question, it is critical also to design the scale to collect the answer. Survey questionnaires are usually aimed to collect structured and quantitative data, Therefore, we should avoid open-ended questions. Rather, we need to use close-ended ones. There are 4 different types of scales to choose from. Nominal scale, when possible answers fall within categories that do not have any form of order or sequence. For example, the industrial sector. We can provide a list of industrial sectors to choose from, but there is no logical sequence. We cannot say that manufacturing is bigger than service or vice versa. Ordinal scale, when categories do have a clear order. This is the case, for example, of micro, small, medium and large companies, which are categories with a clear progression from the smallest to the biggest. However, the distance among 2 of them is not constant, since the difference between micro and small enterprises, in terms of employees, is not the same between medium and large ones. Interval scale, when categories are not only ordered, but also have the same distance between any couple of nearby values. For example, if we define categories related to percentages, such as 1 to 20%, 21 to 40%, 41 to 60%, 61 to 80%, 81 to 100%. Ratio scale, which has the same property of the interval scale, plus a meaningful zero that represents the absence or non-existence of the phenomenon. For example, if we ask about the sales of a company, we use a ratio scale, because if the answer is 0, this means that the company has no sales at all. It is important to remark that ratio or interval scales, such as the number of employees of a firm, can be reduced to an ordinal scale. For example, to simplify responses by defining ranges. For example, instead of asking for the exact number of employees, we can provide the standard European categories: micro from 1 to 9, small from 10 to 49, medium from 50 to 249, and large. But in doing so, we lose some information, and therefore the possibility to conduct certain types of analysis afterwards. Besides, we need to make sure our ranges follow a clear logic. Vice versa, we cannot transform nominal or ordinal scales into interval ones. This would be a major mistake. So far we have seen the scales we can use for objective measures. In the next lecture, we will discuss the scales we can use for perceptive measures.